Well, I think it's achieved different things in different contexts, but in the United States, I think what became really clear is that it really changed the conversation. If we look at what the national conversation in the United States was before Occupy Wall Street, it was all about the budget crisis and austerity and so-called entitlement cuts, and basically passing on the bill for the economic crisis that had been created by the elites, by the 1%, to the people who did least to create that crisis and are most vulnerable to its effects. And it was really like a dam breaking when Occupy came on the scene, and there was something about the framing of "we are the 99% that opened up a space to talk about inequality. And I think that because it was a moral discussion, it was really a discussion about values. There was, I think, some shame that was brought to the idea of passing on the bill for the crisis. And that's one of the things that I find so sort of interesting and inspiring about being in Liberty Plaza / Zuccotti Park was the conversation that was going on, often a silent conversation between the occupiers holding their signs and the bankers walking by, where it was really an appeal to values, and in some cases an attempt to try to bring a sense of shame to acting without principle, to acting based on greed, to acting as if people don't matter and as if there are no consequences to your actions. And I think that the collapse of the so-called super committee that was tasked with coming up with a list of cuts and budget cuts, it can in part be credited to Occupy. I've been involved in the anti-Keystone fight since the beginning, and we were very clear that that when the Occupy movement arrived on the scene, really putting corporate corruption front and center, really putting the spotlight on the nexus between corporate power and political power, the buying off of politicians, that really helped us in the Keystone fight, because it became more and more a discussion of this relationship between the Obama administration and TransCanada and all of the insider dealings and way too cozy relationships that informed the environmental review, that informed the entire process. And I think it became harder for the Obama administration to do what they were clearly intending to do, which was to rubber stamp the Keystone XL pipeline. I mean, this company was so sure that they were going to get a rubber stamp that they went ahead and bought the pipe, that they went ahead and mowed the lawn, that mowed the fields to lay that pipe before they had a permit, that they went ahead and bullied ranchers up and down the pipeline route, telling them that they were going to use eminent domain against them before they had the permit. So they had reason to believe that they were going to win, and they didn't win. I mean, we haven't won either. Right now it's a standoff and the thing is on ice. But I'm not so sure we would have won what we did win, which was a one-year reprieve and Obama feeling that he couldn't rubber stamp this in an election year without Occupy Wall Street. So, even though no to Keystone XL wasn't a demand of Occupy Wall Street, what you're seeing is that the context and the changing of the conversation has created space for people who do have clear demands to potentially win some of those demands in ways that we didn't imagine were possible several months ago. I think it is a movement that is, going at the underlying values of the culture. It isn't just, I mean, there is a huge amount of interest in policy and reinstating Glass-Steagall and in reining in the banks and getting corporations out of politics and in stripping corporations of their personhood. All of that is there. But deeper than that is a challenge to the underlying values that are governing society, and challenging a greed-based culture and a hyper-individualist culture. And part of that challenge, the flip side of the attempt to sort of shame the bankers, has been embodying another way to relate to one another. And I was lucky enough to be part of this conversation that Eve Ensler, the playwright, sort of, I say organized, it was barely organized. I mean, Eve just sort of sat on the steps one night at Occupy in New York and invited people to tell them their stories of what brought them to the park and what kept them at the park. And it was really wonderful to watch because it started with a pretty small group, and then by the end there were probably 100 people sort of huddled around telling their stories, eventually using the human microphone, because as the crowd got larger, they needed it. And I remember this one woman, young woman, said that she'd gone to a protest, and as she was leaving, this is an Occupy protest, a man came up to her and said, "I love you." And she said at first she was like really kind of freaked out and creeped out by this, and then she was thinking about it, and she thought, "I'm going to do it." And she said, "I love you too." And that was her answer to what kept her there. And she was still, confused by it, as I think she has a right to be. But there was something about that exchange that embodied what was going on in that park for her and in that moment for her. So yeah, people are finding other parts of themselves and finding other ways of being with each other. Well, I think the start of Occupy was a cry of rage at inequality, at corporate abuse, at just the outrageousness of the fact that a crisis that was created by the elites is being passed on to the most vulnerable. At the incredible double standards of the fact that the people who least need a bailout are the ones who get a bailout, and the people who need it most are confronted with the hardest hearts. And that's what brought people together. But in the ways that people have come together, there has been this attempt to try to build the society that we want in miniature. And that's been true of all the occupations where there has been that element. In New York, which is where I spend the most time. I mean, you have the fact that people are being fed and that there's free health care, but also that the way the kitchen is being run is with a gray water system, and compost and organic food that's coming from local farms to the extent that they were able to do that. Interestingly, there was a move within the park to move from petroleum-based generators to bicycle generators, and that was starting to happen. Then the police came in and just took the petroleum generators. So then I think 14 bicycle generators were built. So there was an ecological consciousness to that occupation sort of built into it, despite the fact that climate change and the big sort of ecological issues were a bit of an afterthought in the sort of official texts. But I think that as we inevitably have the discussion of, okay, this economic model has failed the vast majority of people on this planet, what is our alternative? What kind of economy will work for the majority of people, for everyone? What kind of economy is going to create full employment, work with dignity, is not going to foul our planet? Then what we see is that the solutions to the economic crisis are the same solutions that we need for the ecological crisis, because we aren't just facing an economic crisis. We are facing a profound ecological crisis that is intimately linked to the same greed-based economic model, growth-based economic model, a model that can't ever say enough or have enough, that has no brakes. I mean, this same mentality that trashes people, trashes the planet. And so what we're starting to see is discussions happening about occupying the food movement, occupying the food system, for instance, occupying the farms, occupying the rooftops for solar energy, and green co-ops. In fact, Occupy New York just passed a resolution to form their first green co-op, a printing press. So jobs are going to start to be created, on a small scale. But I mean, it isn't just about within, an encampment. It's that, I was part of the so-called anti-globalization movement, the movement that was not anti-globalization, but was anti-corporate and anti-capitalist, and challenging this economic model. And so we were having a discussion a decade ago about precisely the things that we're talking about now, about the corporate takeover of our lives and the attacks on public space and the increase in inequality, and all of these economic rules that sacrifice people and the planet in favor of economic growth. And at that, in North America, that movement kind of got blasted off the map after 9/11. It sort of splintered. But it didn't disappear. It didn't go away. And a lot of people who had been part of that movement kind of put their heads down and started building the alternatives locally. And that took many forms, but some of the forms it took was building an incredible food movement, all kinds of creative ways to relocalize economies, community-based energy. And so now, 10 years ago, they used to say, well, we know what you're against, but what are you for? What's your alternative? And that was kind of a theoretical discussion. What is your alternative? It's sort of like, let's think about it and, write a little pamphlet. But now we've got 10 years of actual living alternatives to point to that actually have a track record, an incredible track record of job creation, of protecting communities from vulnerability, from the vulnerability to economic shocks. And so now, but yet it's a niche market. It isn't really getting at the core crisis of capitalism, whether ecological or economic. It's not enough. So sort of like we have these little showrooms and we can go, this can work, but it isn't working in the sense that it is not big enough, it isn't widespread enough to actually deal with the scale of the crisis that we're dealing with. We need much more. And so what I find exciting is this opposition movement coming together with these alternatives that have been developed, and these two strains braiding together, and this movement that has come to realize that it isn't enough just to build your little alternative in the corner. You actually need to confront power, and people who realize it isn't enough just to confront power. We have to have alternatives. We can't just be against. We also have to be for. These strains are coming together, and that is, to me, the most exciting thing about this political moment. Well, I mean, part of it is we need to realize that certainly in this country, the infrastructure that we're getting is doubling down on the old model. I mean, this is why the fight against the tar sands pipeline is in this province is so key, because it's not just like we're sort of staying put with the old economy. We're doubling down on the dirtiest fossil fuels possible, and in British Columbia, it's particularly stark because in some ways this is Vancouver is this great green city. You have all of these wonderful alternatives. People are very proud of it, but at the same time, the actual vision for British Columbia and even for Vancouver specifically is to be a gateway, to be the fossil fuel gateway for the continent to the Pacific Rim, to ship all the coal from the Powder River Basin, to ship the oil from the tar sands, the natural gas. I mean, the amount of fracking that is going on in this province, right? So there is this crazy dualism going on where, in parts of Vancouver, people are priding themselves so much on being so green, and then on this massive institutional scale, we actually are on the verge of enabling a doubling down on some of the most dangerous fossil fuels on the planet. And I think that really shows how you can't just sort of quietly build your alternative and sort of tune out all of these issues, or you're really living a lie. So I think there's a moral responsibility for people in British Columbia to realize actually how much power this province has. When you have these local-based struggles, people often feel, well, what does it matter what we do here, because they'll just get it somewhere else. But what you see with the tar sands fight is they cannot get the oil out to Asia. And they want to sell to China. They also want to ship it down to California. They can't do it without going through British Columbia. The one good thing about the tar sands is that they're landlocked. They do not have a route to the sea, right? They just tried to build one down to the Gulf Coast to ship to Europe, to ship to South America, but they still want to get to the West Coast. They have to get to the West Coast in order to fulfill their growth plans. They want to increase tar sands production by 3 or 4 times. And this is a central part of their business plan. So that means people here have both power and tremendous responsibility. Because if people are able to say, no, we won't let it out, that has an impact not just in protecting this precious coast and these rivers and waters from a potential oil spill, but a tremendous impact on the world climate. James Hansen has said that if we exploit the oil and the tar sands on a massive scale, it's game over for the climate. So we often feel, I think, a sense of powerlessness, like what can we do? We can do a lot in this province. We can have a huge impact, and there's real responsibility in that. There is already an economic crisis, and it hasn't gone away. Things weren't so great before Wall Street crashed in 2008. It hasn't recovered. And what's going on in Europe right now is extremely precarious. And we have to be ready for another shock, a big one. And Canada is not going to be protected. And we now have a Tory majority. The only thing that protected us last time from a much worse dose of austerity and shock therapy is that Harper had a minority. And he tried. I mean, let's remember, he tried. He tried to exploit the crisis to put forward an austerity budget, and and the government almost collapsed over it, and he had to withdraw it, right? So it's no secret that they have much more ambitious plans for this country. Ambitious in terms of dismantling healthcare and really just doing away with the already shredded social safety net. They want this country to be more like the United States. We know that. This model that is failing spectacularly, they want to be more like it. And they will absolutely use the next crisis, the next shock to say, oh, sorry, all those things that we said during the election and our promises of moderation, we just can't afford that anymore because we have a crisis on our hands. So, I mean, the script is so clear, it's so predictable, we all know it, they've tried it so many times. And, that's why I think it is so crucial that people are mobilized now. And in many ways, I think that's the most important thing about the Occupy movement and the Occupy moment is that these connections, these networks, these relationships that we're building now will be our shock absorbers, right? It will mean that when they do this next time, we will already know how to mobilize. We will already know each other. We'll have learned from our mistakes and our growing pains, and we will be ready to block them. And we have to that means being in the streets in huge numbers. That means learning from our friends in Europe who really know how to fight. And I think these are winnable battles. But the Conservatives have to get the message that it will cost them. There will be a huge political price. They ran on these messages that they were going to be moderate because Canadians are not as right-wing as the Tories. They had to say that in order to get elected. They know that. Believe me, they know that. They spend a lot of time gauging what they can get away with, and they pushed it as far as they can. So the key is going to be to interfere with that message that we have no choice. And the way you interfere with that message is, first of all, to say no, but also to say, okay, here's where you're going to get the money. You have to have your own plan. Whether that means increasing taxes on the wealthy, which it should absolutely be increased in this country. 1% in Canada has done spectacularly well. They had income increases over the past decade of 36%, and yet they had tax reductions. They didn't need those tax cuts. When your income goes up 36% and the rest of the population has a flat medium income, that 1% can afford to have their taxes go up. So people have to know it. They need to know their economics, so that when the crisis comes, people don't just defer to the experts. I mean, or not put forward alternatives. You have to say, okay, sure, we got a budget crisis. Go where the money is. Here's where it is. It's in the military. It's in your plan to build prisons that we don't need. And if you need more money, tax corporations and tax the rich. And here's why. And there has to be a very, very clear, unified message on these things. It is what's exciting about this movement. Is that it is reaching not just the usual suspects, right? But then it's just like, oh, but you don't talk like us, and you haven't learned everything, and it's more comfortable actually to deal with the usual suspects. I think there has to be a multiplicity of approaches, because I think for some people, are just not going to be able to deal with some of the political naivete that gets expressed. You know, it's too painful, it's too frustrating. Not everybody has to do the basic political education, you know. I think there have to be spaces that are reserved for it. And the assumption, I don't think the assumption should be that everybody has to do it. I think some people love doing it. Some people, yeah, have, you know, did a hell of a lot of it 30 years ago and don't want to do it anymore and don't. I think so long as it's clear that there's a plan and a structure for how you take people on a journey. I mean, this is a journey. And it's tremendously exciting that people are coming in and, you know, and just coming from their hearts and their direct experience, and they haven't read all the books that they're supposed to read, and they're going to make mistakes, and if they get blasted for that, you know, in a really, really intolerant way, then they're going to get lost. So I think, you know, understanding, you know, who's going to do that basic political education and bridge building, and also what can we learn from them, that I think that's going to be really, really key. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of whether there's more. I think it's just also just being aware that what we're trying to do has never been done before. You know, you look at Tahrir Square and you know and the Arab Spring, and you know how amazingly inspiring that was. I mean, it was incredible, and it inspired this movement. As did other movements, as did the Spanish indignados and the Chilean students. But you know, overthrowing a dictator is not the same as overthrowing neoliberalism, which is a absolutely decentralized, headless network that locks itself in and morphs and reaches into every aspect of our lives. And you know, now that the Egyptians have overthrown Mubarak and you know and have elections, now they have to learn how to overthrow neoliberalism. And that is really, really hard. So the truth is, we've never done this. I mean, we can learn from, you know, we can look at countries in Latin America where there have been some progress made in moving away from neoliberal economic models, and they're far from perfect, but there are definitely lessons to learn about social mobilization and how you get out of neoliberal laws. I always think, you know, about Evo Morales coming to power. One of the first interviews he gave was with the BBC, and he said, "I'm a prisoner in the neoliberal palace. I'm a prisoner in the palace. I'm locked in with all of these neoliberal laws." You know, and what's important to understand about that is that even when you have this historic election, you know, when you have an indigenous leader brought to power by mass social movements, the first thing he says is, "I don't have the power to do what I want to do," right? So I say this because I think it is so important for people to admit that they do not know how to do this, and that it is absolutely terrifying to go up against transnational capital and to think about how to rebuild on the scale that we're talking about. Because once you admit that you're actually scared and that you don't know, then it becomes clear that a lot of what you're doing is fear-based response. And you know, when you're afraid, you go to something that's more familiar, and you know, maybe that familiarity is just attacking the person next to you at a meeting because you know how to do that and you can win that fight. You know, and maybe it's making a fetish of autonomism and saying, you know, I'm never going to make a political demand in my entire life because I think that demands are oppressive. You know, all of it just keeps us from actually doing what we're afraid of. So I think there's all kinds of different ways that we manifest that fear. I think it starts with admitting that nobody's done this before. It's totally terrifying. It's not just terrifying because nobody's done it before. It's terrifying because the force of the state comes down on you in very, very real ways when you do. So I say we admit that. Admit that we're going to express and manifest that fear in different and individual ways, some of which will be more obvious than others. Some of us will be better at disguising our fear than others. But I think it's a really important starting point. And you know, if this is a fallow period, right? If this is the winter, you know, and this is, I'm borrowing from some of my friends in New York, that we should use it, you know, because capitalism is a crisis machine, and the next shock is coming, the next crisis is coming. And we're going to have to be really organized, and we're not going to have as much time for process, and education, and in-reach, as somebody said. We've got to do outreach, but we also have to do in-reach. Another phrase I learned when I was in New York recently. So if we have a moment now, we should use it to do that work, because it's coming. Well, I think part of it is that we can't fight these battles as individual battles only. I mean, we have to be more networked. I was talking with Harsha yesterday about this. It's like in this province, it's like playing whack-a-mole, you know, that game. And it's like you win one fight against a mine, you know, and a pipeline comes up, and you win one fight against a pipeline, and another pipeline comes up. And I mean, it's between the wealth, or the resource wealth that is in this land, under this soil, and what it represents to bring the wealth of the Alberta tar sands and the Powder River Basin through this province and ship it out. I mean, it is a final colonial pillage that's going on right now. And it's just, this is the vision, is just to save the economy by clawing away at the earth in the most violent way, and pretending that climate change isn't happening. I mean, we are in such an insane moment right now, collectively, where not only are we not moving away from fossil fuels, we are doubling down on the most carbon-intensive fossil fuels. Our emissions are soaring. Canada committed to decrease our emissions by 6% by this point in the Kyoto Protocol, and our emissions are up 30%. So, I mean, we are a climate criminal. We have an absolutely insane government that, on the one hand, is in Durban right now saying, well, we're backing out of the Kyoto Protocol because it isn't binding on the Chinese. We want the Chinese to cut their emissions if we're going to cut our emissions. And then the Prime Minister comes to Vancouver 2 days ago and says it's a matter of national interest that we build the Northern Gateway Pipeline because we have to sell the dirtiest fuel on the planet to the Chinese, which, by the way, is going to send their emissions soaring. So he needs to decide whether he wants the Chinese to cut their emissions or increase their emissions, because he's definitely sending mixed messages. What they obviously want is a complete Wild West, where nobody has any restrictions whatsoever. So, you know, I think we have to understand it's a vision of the world that we're up against. It is this extractive mentality and this refusal to even believe that the future exists, and a really collective insanity. And, you know, I think people in British Columbia are so lucky to be living in a province that is 95% unceded Aboriginal territory. And to be living in a province where there are First Nations people with so much courage and principle, and willingness to fight, because there are tools in this province because of that, because this is unceded land, that are not available in many other parts of the world. I mean, it makes these fights winnable in a way that they are much harder to win elsewhere. And, you know, the discussion in the media is always pitting First Nations rights against so-called Canadian rights, as if it's a competition. And we need to actually see it as a gift. We need to be so grateful that this land has not been treated away, because in this critical moment in human history, I think it's going to be our last defense. The way I define the shock doctrine, it's a really anti-democratic process. I don't think people should use it. You know, what I mean specifically about it is using crisis to ram through policies that do not have popular consent. Okay, it's not. I mean, some people interpret the shock doctrine to mean like any decisive response to crisis. No, I mean, crises are messages. For the most part, you know, if you're dealing with a massive crisis, it's because something's wrong. You know, sometimes there can be a crisis that's just a crisis, like an earthquake. But the kind of crisis we're dealing with, economic crises or natural disasters linked to climate change, these are messages. They're telling us your system is broken, do something. So it's deeply irresponsible not to respond in decisive ways to crisis. And there's a deep progressive history of responding to crisis with social transformation that actually gets at the root of the crisis. And that's what happened after the Great Depression. The right understands that economic crisis is good for the left, naturally. Like if there is a crisis created by capitalism, it creates an opening for progressives to come in with alternatives and to rein in capitalism. The entire think tank infrastructure, the right-wing think tank infrastructure, exists to circumvent that natural defense mechanism, that natural immune process, so that the response to crisis isn't the rational one. Let's fix this, right? That's how people immediately responded to the economic crisis. You didn't need to have big seminars and teach-ins to convince people that there was something wrong with Wall Street and something wrong with the banks. They understood that. You actually had to work really, really hard to convince them that the solution was budget cuts and passing on the crisis to the public. It took quite a few years to do that. So, you know, I think I want to be really clear that that's an anti-democratic. Shock doctrine is an anti-democratic tactic. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We want to respond to real crises with real solutions to those crises. And what I was referring to earlier about, you know, how the responses to the economic crisis are also the responses to the ecological crisis. That's an example, you know, of a positive response to crisis, of getting the messages that crises are sending us, and developing alternatives that give us a more stable society, both ecologically and economically, so that we're not reeling from shock to shock. I hope so. I think it can if we play it right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.